أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today we will be studying chapter 20 from The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times by René Guénon Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya rahimahullah. This is a particularly challenging chapter. It is entitled From Sphere to Cube, and it continues to elaborate upon the central concept for much of the rest of the book, which was introduced by Guénon in chapter 17, namely the solidification of the world. And in chapter 18, he deals with scientific mythology and popularization, then the limits of history and geography. These are all examples of what he calls the solidification of the world. Examples or illustrations. And it is there that he picks up the theme in chapter 20 with the opening sentence, "Now that a few illustrations have been given of what has been called the solidification of the world, there remains the question of its representation in geometrical symbolism." Guénon is very interested, obviously, in symbolism, and he had a deep training in mathematics, and so he is also concerned very much with mathematical symbolism, and specifically in this case, the symbolism of geometry. So what is the geometrical symbolism of the solidification of the world? Guénon says in this chapter, in the opening sentences, that it is symbolized by the gradual transition from the sphere, or what we may call the symbolism of the sphere, to the cube, or what we may term the symbolism of the cube. So for Guénon, the sphere symbolizes something very specific, and the cube symbolizes something very specific. To be more precise, the sphere, according to Guénon, is the most universal of all forms. It's the most universal form of all, because it contains, in a certain sense, every other kind of form. It is the least specified of all forms. It is similar to itself in all directions. No matter how it is rotated, about its center, all its successive positions are strictly superimposable on one another. It also is a symbol for what, in many traditions across the world, is known as the egg of the world. So let's read this opening paragraph, opening few sentences from the opening paragraph. "Now that a few illustrations have been given of what has been called the solidification of the world, there remains the question of its representation in geometrical symbolism, wherein it can be figured as a gradual transition from sphere to cube. Indeed, to begin with, the sphere is intrinsically the primordial form, because it is the least specified of all, similar to itself in every direction, in such a way that in any rotatory movement about its center, all its successive positions are strictly superimposable one on another." So if we take an audio-visual aid, this is something known as the Lennart sphere, or you could take any kind of a ball. You can see that it has what in modern mathematics would be called an infinite rotational symmetry. It looks the same in all directions. You can impose any set of axes on a sphere, and it doesn't change anything. That's not the case with a cube or something like a... Could you hand me the dodecahedron? Take that stuff out of there. Yeah, okay. So you have another form like this. This is a dodecahedron. This is not symmetrical in every direction. Now, it is possible I need another sphere. I should have done this before. I don't have it, but you can imagine this contained inside of this. So this shape, the dodecahedron, which is 12 pentagons formed into a solid, can be fit inside a sphere. And so can a cube, so can a tetrahedron, so can an icosahedron as well. The sphere, then, can be said to be the most universal form of all, containing in a certain sense all other forms, which will emerge from it by means of differentiations taking place in certain particular directions. And that is why the spherical form is, in all traditions, according to Genon, that of the egg of the world. So, in ancient Pelasgian myth, in Finnish myth, Persian, Slavic, Chinese, ancient Egyptian, Polynesian, ancient Greek Orphism, the Hindu or the Vedic, Japan, Bantu, which is South Africa, the Dogon people, which is West Africa, you find some notion or another of something called the cosmic egg or the primordial egg or the egg of the world. Just by way, to be more specific, by way of example, in the Hindu or Vedic tradition, you have the notion of the Hiranya Garbha, or the golden womb or golden cosmic egg, which is mentioned in the text known as the Rig Veda in the 10th Mandal 1-1, or the 10th book, verse 1-1. So this egg of the world is the form of that which represents the global integrality in their first and embryonic state of all possibilities that will be developed in the course of a cycle of manifestation. So, it is the sphere that inaugurates the cycle of manifestation, symbolically speaking, and it culminates in the cube, which is so if the sphere is the maximum of all possibilities, then the cube is the maximum of solidification, fixity, and stability. Now this, as I said before, is a rather challenging chapter. I'm going to do my best to make it as clear as possible. And about halfway through, Genon introduces another theme, which is the theme of the heavenly Jerusalem, which I think will be pretty confusing for probably most readers today. So I'm going to do my best to remove any confusion. And then he returns to the symbolism of geometry and the solidification of the world and concludes the chapter. So let's proceed. Strictly speaking, the sphere, because this is the primordial or first state, so far as our world is concerned, according to Genon, it properly belongs to the domain of subtle manifestation, inasmuch as subtle manifestation necessarily precedes gross manifestation. And it, in other words, the sphere, is its immediate principle. In other words, it is the immediate principle of subtle manifestation. And that is why, according to Genon, the form of the sphere, or its two-dimensional analog, namely the circle, is in fact never realized in the corporeal world. So in the actual world of extension, this is not a perfect sphere. And if I give you something which is circular, like this ring which supports it, this is not really a perfect circle. So the perfect circle or the perfect sphere is never really realized, is never completely and fully realized in the corporeal domain, because it is, in both cases, sphere and circle, its proper domain is that of the subtle domain. There's an interesting footnote here. He says, the movement of the celestial bodies can be given as an example. It's not exactly circular, but elliptical. This is true. The orbits of the planets are not perfectly circular. They are elliptical, but they're only very slightly elliptical. The ellipse constitutes, as it were, a first specification of the circle. by the spiraling of the center into two poles or foci in the direction of one of the diameters, which thereafter plays a special axial part, while at the same time all the other diameters are differentiated one from another in respect of their lengths. It may be added incidentally in this connection that since the planets describe the ellipses of which the sun occupies one of the foci, the question arises as to what the other focus corresponds to. It's a very interesting question. As there is nothing corporeal actually there, there must be something belonging only to the subtle order. But that question cannot be further examined here, as it would be quite outside our subject. I wish he had dealt with that. I really wonder, what he would have said if he had developed that further. But anyhow, it's an interesting footnote. Not to get off the topic. So, if the sphere is of the subtle domain, then opposed to that is the cube, and this is what he introduces in the second paragraph on page 138. The cube is the most arrested form of all, if it can be so expressed, he says. This means that it corresponds to a maximum of specification, solidity, stability, fixity, the stoppage of all movement. The cube is also the form that is symbolically related to the earth, or that symbolizes the earth, because earth, not as planet but as element, one of the four, is the terminating and final element in the scheme of manifestation of the corporeal state, and consequently it, the cube, corresponds also to the end of the cycle of manifestation, or to what has been called the stopping point of the cyclical movement. So this solidification of the world, symbolically speaking, the two extrema of this are the sphere and the cube. The cube is the maximum of fixity and solidification. He states further that it is evident that the equilibrium of a cube resting on one of its faces is in fact more stable than that of any other body. It is important to note that this stability, coming at the end of the descending movement, so to speak, of manifestation, is not and cannot be anything but an unqualified immobility, of which the nearest representation in the corporeal world is afforded by the minerals. Now, this is important, this theme of the minerals. He just introduces this, but with Gelon, it's rarely just a one-off. He will come back to this 2 chapters later in the section on metallurgy, the significance of metallurgy, chapter 22, and I believe he does touch briefly on this as well in the symbolism of the story of Cain and Abel, both in the Quran and in the Holy Bible as well, and that is the theme of chapter 21. So make a note of this, about the minerals. He's going to come back to them. And this immobility, this unqualified immobility that is talking about, which is in the corporeal world, its nearest representation is the minerals. He says, and this immobility, if it could be entirely realized, would really be the inverted reflection of the lowest point of the principial immutability of the highest point. Immobility or stability, thus understood and represented by the cube, is therefore related to the substantial pole of manifestation, just as immutability, in which all possibilities are comprehended in the global state, represented by the sphere, is related to the essential pole. And this is why the cube also symbolizes the idea of base or foundation, which again corresponds to the substantial pole. Attention must also be drawn to the fact that the faces of a cube can be considered as being oriented in opposite pairs corresponding to the 3 dimensions of space, in other words, as parallel to the 3 planes determined by the axes forming the system of coordinates to which that space is related and which allows of its being measured, that is, of its being effectively realized in its integrality. It has been explained elsewhere, namely in his book, The Symbolism of the Cross, that the 3 axes forming the 3-dimensional cross must be looked upon as being traced through the center of a sphere that fills the whole of space by its indefinite expansion. And this establishes, I've skipped the parenthetical, and this establishes the relation that exists between the two extreme forms, sphere and cube, a relation in which what was interior and central in the sphere is, so to speak, turned inside out to become the surface or the exteriority of the cube. That's on page 139. A lot of words, much verbiage. What Guénon is saying is that within the sphere, we can, if we take, let's say, a compass, we have a spherical compass here. I've already drawn the lines. I'm not going to put a pen in this. So we can put this anywhere on the sphere, and then we can draw an axis. And this is already there because we have to join these two plastic hemispheres going around here. This could be like an equator. And then we can form another, which I've drawn in red here. And these intersect here. If you flatten this out, they make a cross. And then if you can imagine a plane cutting through, let's say, the equator, then you can draw those same lines there as two axes. And then we have a third, which would be the polar axis going this way. And those axes are necessary to designate any point on the sphere. Now, he has this book called the Symbolism of the Cross. He deals with a lot of geometrical symbolism there. I refer you to that, specifically chapter 6. I think it's chapter 6 and chapter 20 of the Symbolism of the Cross, which directly is related to the theme of from sphere to cube. But there he talks about a shift from polar to rectangular coordinates. And what he really means is that you can specify any point in a plane by a radius and also by a circle. But when you go to a sphere, because we live on that sphere, the radius is fixed. We only need two other numbers, which nowadays is done using latitude and longitude. And obviously we don't live inside the sphere, so we don't have... we live on the surface of the sphere, so we only need those two. But then there's four directions: north, south, east, and west. And anyhow, the system of latitude and longitude is well known. So this is all he is talking about in that paragraph. That, in other words, the transitions from sphere to cube is somehow sort of implicit in the shape itself when you impose a system of coordinates. All right. So, moving along. He already pointed out the correspondence between the cube and the earth. He returns to this at the bottom of the actual text on page 139. The cube also represents, it's just two lines from the bottom of the page, not including the footnotes. The cube also represents the earth in all the traditional meanings of that word. That is, not only earth as a corporeal element, in the sense in which it was mentioned above, but also as a principle of a much more universal order. Here he is alluding to what is known as the Great Triad. He has a book with that title. In the ancient Chinese tradition, you don't really have this discussion of sphere to cube, as far as I understand it, and it seems to be what Guénon is saying here, is that on the contrary, we have heaven and earth. And in connection with heaven and earth, we have man, or universal man, and that is the Great Triad. So he speaks of the principle designated in the Far Eastern tradition as earth, Ti, in correlation with heaven, Tien. And he says that this is a more universal sort of symbolism. He says that this is a principle of a much more universal order. Spherical or circular forms are related to heaven. Now he's connecting this to the Chinese symbolism. And cubic or square forms are related to earth. Now these two complementary terms, sphere and cube, are also related to, or are the equivalents of, the Vedic notions of Purush and Prakriti, Purusha and Prakriti, which were covered much earlier in these lectures because they're in the earliest chapters of the book and indeed from the very introduction. And Purusha and Prakriti also are just another expression of essence and substance taken in their universal meaning. Again, this has all been dealt with in the first, 5, 6, 7 lectures, maybe the first 10 lectures. So go back to those. If you are not sure, go back to those early chapters. He says that it is also evident that, like the conceptions of essence and substance, the same symbolism is always susceptible of application at different levels. That is to say, either to the principles of a particular state of existence or to the integrality of universal manifestations. So this symbolism can be looked at on more than one level. Not only are these two geometrical forms related to heaven and to earth, continues René, but so also are the instruments used to draw them, namely the compass and the square. And this is so in the symbolism of the Far Eastern tradition as well as in that of Western initiatic traditions. There's a footnote here. I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself. It is interesting, but I would like to stay on topic because there's a lot to cover. And the different correspondences of these two forms give rise in different circumstances to multiple symbolic and ritual applications. When he's talking about the compass and the square, this obviously is the compass. I am showing this because so many people today are not aware of these things. They don't draw. They do everything on their phones. That this is an absolutely fundamental instrument. So you have this instrument. It has a pointy thing here, and then it has a pencil lead, or in some of them you can actually attach a pencil, and you put it down, and you just do this. And it gives you a very nice circle. These kinds of instruments were considered sacred. This is a very good one. This is probably a pre-World War II compass. You can still buy these sets on eBay, but people don't learn how to use these anymore. They don't teach geometry properly anymore. So this is the compass that he's talking about, not to be confused with this kind of a compass, which is used for finding direction. And then he talks about the square. Now the square is more something used by carpenters. It's actually just an L-shaped kind of thing. It looks like a short ruler and a long ruler joined together. But this is what we're talking about. Typically, when you draw, you have two triangles, and this is the side of a square. This is a 45, 45. This is 45 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees. And this is a 30, 60. So this is 30 degrees here. This is 60 degrees here. This is 90 degrees. And this is what people used to learn to draw with. And I have a lot of these lying around, so I thought I would show this to you. It's important to keep this in mind. So now he jumps to this concept of the heavenly Jerusalem. I will come back to that and deal with that at the end. I want to conclude because he comes back. He introduces this heavenly Jerusalem notion on 140, about almost all the way, 2/3 of the way down. It stretches over to 141. And then about a third of the way down on page 142. And then he comes back to this transition from sphere to cube. Now, and that's how he concludes on page 143. So what he's talking about here is that this solidification is not indefinite. It cannot go on forever. It has to arrive at its terminal point. He says, it is nonetheless true that if consideration is confined to the present cycle, a moment finally arrives at which the wheel stops turning. He puts that phrase in quotes. And here, as always, the symbolism is perfectly coherent, for a wheel is circular in shape. And if it were to get out of shape, very important point, in such a way as to end by being a square, well, obviously it won't roll anymore, right? It is obvious that it could not do otherwise than stop. This is why the moment in question appears as an end of time. It is then, according to the Hindu tradition, writes Ganon, that the 12 suns will shine simultaneously. This is a tradition in the Hindu, the Vedic teaching. For time is in fact measured by the passage of the sun through the 12 signs of the zodiac, making the annual cycle. And when the rotation is stopped, the 12 corresponding aspects will, so to speak, be merged into one, thus returning into the essential and primordial unity of their common nature, since they do not differ except in their relation to universal manifestation, which will then be at an end. So he's saying that symbolically speaking, the cycle will terminate, the wheel will stop turning, and then according to this Hindu tradition, the 12 suns will shine simultaneously. That's very interesting. This moment of stopping is also, oddly enough, mentioned in some way in the Islamic tradition. There is a hadith in the Sunan of At-Tirmidhi, as well as in Bukhari and Muslim, with very slightly different wording, narrated through the companion Abu Hurairah, who said that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تطلع الشمس من مغربها. In other words, the hour will not arise, the end of the world will not happen until the sun is seen to rise from the place that it sets. In other words, that it rises from the west. Now, how is that possible? I will need the globe. In the footnote there, which is footnote 15, Genon says that this has to do with a pole shift. So the Earth rotates from west to east, which means it's doing this. Now, if you look at it from the top, it's rotating one way, but if you look at it from the bottom, it's the other way around. So he says that this is symbolic of some kind of a polar shift, which is supposed to take place at the end of the cycle. And who knows? Allah knows best. This maximum of fixation or solidity is also known, according to Genon, as a mathematical problem. And again, he's very interested in the symbolic implications of geometry and mathematics, as the problem of the squaring of the circle. Those who declare, he says, at the very bottom sentence on 142, stretching over to 143, those who declare that this is an insoluble problem, though they be wholly unaware of its symbolical significance, are thus right in fact, since the squaring understood in its true sense cannot be realized until the end of the cycle. So this is a problem in mathematics. It goes back to ancient Greece. The idea is that if you're given a particular square of some side, the task is to construct a circle of the same area as that square, using obviously a finite number of steps and employing only a compass and a straight edge. So in other words, if the side of the square is s, then the area will be s squared, and then for a given circle of radius 1, will be pi r squared, which will be pi, which would mean that s, to get the same area, would have to be the square root of pi. So the square root of pi squared is pi, and pi times the radius 1 squared of the circle is pi, and so pi equals pi. Anyway, this is not possible to perform using only a straight edge and a compass. This is a consequence of a theorem known as the Lindemann-Weierstrass theorem, which proves that pi is a transcendental number. And so it is a consequence of that, because a transcendental number is any real or complex number such that it is not the root of a non-zero polynomial with integer coefficients. So there's a lot of math there. Whether you appreciate all that or not, it doesn't really matter to understand this. It's simply not possible, mathematically speaking, to have a square and to construct of the same circle of the same area. Okay. A consequence of all this is that the solidification of the world appears to some extent to have a double meaning, considered in itself and from within the cycle as being a consequence of a movement leading down toward quantity and materiality. It evidently has an unfavorable significance, even a sinister one, opposed to spirituality. But in another aspect, it is nonetheless necessary in order to prepare though it be in a manner that could be called negative, the ultimate fixation of the results of the cycle in the form of the heavenly Jerusalem. So now let's come back to what is this heavenly Jerusalem. So if we go back to page 140, 2/3 of the way down, he introduces this concept of the heavenly Jerusalem. And I quote, and he says this is directly related to this symbolic movement from sphere to cube, which is the symbol of the solidification of the world. Another case in which the relation of the same geometrical form is in evidence is that of the symbolism of the terrestrial paradise and the heavenly Jerusalem. They're the same thing. Terrestrial paradise, heavenly Jerusalem. Excuse me. He says that he refers to this in another book. That's in footnote 11. It's called The King of the World, and he also talks about it in Symbolism of the Cross in chapter 9. Now he says that this concept of the heavenly Jerusalem is especially important from the point of view adopted in this book, since the symbolism in question is in fact concerned with the two extremities of the present cycle. So because it's so important for Genon, we have to deal with it. So the two extremities of the present cycle are the terrestrial paradise and the heavenly Jerusalem. So this concept of the heavenly Jerusalem is introduced in something called the Book of Revelation. It is the last book of the Christian scripture known as the New Testament. The New Testament is a real quagmire. It's getting dark. Can you turn on another light? So obviously, as a Muslim, I find the New Testament to be an extremely problematic work. Anybody who is aware of the writings, most recently of the criticism of the New Testament, knows that there are huge problems there. And the most recent and well-known of these researches are those of Bart Ehrman. So I don't really know what to say about this Book of Revelation, but there is this idea in the Book of Revelation, and we have no idea who is the author. They ascribe it to John. Is this the same John who's supposedly the author of the Gospel of John, or is it a different John, John of Patmos? And even in the case of the Gospel of John, we have no idea who this John is. Same with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I mean, we could even call these the Gospel according to Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Sally, Dick, and Jane. We really have no idea about the authorship of these works. Nevertheless, there is a symbolism in this so-called Book of Revelation, which Genon is alluding to. He's assuming that his readers know this. So I'll leave it to the diligent reader to get a copy of the New Testament, easily done nowadays with the internet. You don't even have to own a copy. Just search it. And it is the Book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 9 through 27, where the terrestrial paradise and heavenly Jerusalem are spoken of. So what he has in mind here is a reestablishing of the equilibrium which has been upset towards the end of the cycle. In other words, it is the termination of the solidification of the world. It reaches its extreme limit with the manifestation of what Genon terms the terrestrial paradise, which is none other than the manifestation of the heavenly Jerusalem. This heavenly Jerusalem obviously is associated with the sphere, and the terrestrial paradise is associated with the square. Right. So what is actually going on here? What is going on here is that there is a very ancient concept which is reflected in the Book of Revelation. I'm going to close the book here. Of the idea of a kind of heaven on earth, a kind of heavenly utopia. This is exactly the sort of thing which Plato speaks of in the Republic. It's exactly what he speaks of at great length in the Laws. The Laws is a very large work of Plato. something like 300 pages. Oddly enough, a lot of the modern neocons like Leo Strauss are obsessed with this book. They've completely missed the point. But what is at work in these classic texts by Plato is the notion of a heavenly archetype or a heavenly polity or natural order, both in a natural order and a social order in which there is complete and total harmony. It is a return to the golden age. And so there is a deep symbolism here, and regardless of whether we're referring to the book of Revelation or to Plato, the fact is that there is a very interesting book on the influence of ancient Greek ideas on the New Testament authors. So the book I was looking for is by a guy named Dennis R. MacDonald, The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. Oh, here it is. It was right here the whole time. So he argues that there are tremendous parallels between Homer in terms of themes, which you find in the Gospel of Mark. So it is possible that I would hypothesize, again, I'm not a specialist on this, but I would not be surprised if there are ancient Greek influences also reflected in the book of Revelation ascribed to somebody named John. And what we basically have in Plato, in the Republic and in the Laws, is a kind of notion of a perfect harmony. And this has been dealt with at considerable length by someone named John Mitchell. So if you want to understand further what Genon is talking about here, because he really doesn't go into detail. It's just, oh, well, there's this thing, it's the heavenly Jerusalem, that's the sphere, the terrestrial paradise is the cube, and at the end of the cycle, equilibrium will be established again. There are going to be 12 suns. The sun will rise from the west, stuff like this. He doesn't really explain. So there's a book called The Dimensions of Paradise, Sacred Geometry, Ancient Science, and the Heavenly Order on Earth by John Michel. And there are important passages in the Republic that talk about certain symbolic numbers. One of these is, where's the Republic? We have it here. One of these is what is known as the number of the king, in contrast with the number of the tyrant. That is in the Republic, Book 9, and it's 588, 587, 587 and 588. If you look there, you'll have this whole discussion. So at about 587D, Socrates says a tyrant is 3 times 3 times removed from true pleasure. And then he says that if we take this by squaring and cubing, we'll discover how far a tyrant's pleasure is from the king. Then turning it the other way around, if someone wants to say how far a king's pleasure is from a tyrant's, he'll find, if he completes the calculation, that a king lives 729 times more pleasantly. These are very weird passages, and very few people really understand what they are. But what he is talking about is a symbolic number. And anyhow, I could go into great amount of detail here. I don't know if maybe I should make a separate video on this. But suffice it to say that what he actually has in mind here is the number 27. 27 squared is 729. And if you do that, that gives you the number of days and nights actually in a year. And if you go back and read the passage in Plato, then you will understand better what that means. Now, some people have argued that what this amounts to is the construction of a 27 by 27 magic square, which would be based on the 3 by 3 magic square. I'm sure what I'm saying now sounds absolutely outlandish, but there is a lot of very strange for modern readers, symbolism in these texts. And you have a similar thing happening in the Laws, where not in the Laws. A similar thing happening elsewhere in the Republic. Where in the Republic? This is book 9, so this would be in book 8, where he speaks of the number of the state, or the nuptial number. And this is also something which is very much debated by scholars. What Plato had in mind was, believe it or not, a kind of mathematical basis for the conduct of society, based on the symbolism of numbers. And it's really only explained in detail in this book by John Mitchell, entitled The Dimensions of Paradise. I said John Mitchell. I should have said Jean Michel. I suppose we could even do a separate reading list on Jean Michel, but he deals at length, but with drawings as well, with the concept of the heavenly Jerusalem in this book, the story of creation according to sacred geometry. So I don't really want to go into all of that mathematical detail. If you are interested, I can make a separate video on that, but not until I finish the reign of quantity. But if you're interested, say so in the comments. The point to understand here is that Genon is talking about geometrical symbolism, the transition from sphere, which is the subtle domain, it's the domain of perfection, to the cube, which is the domain of complete solidity and solidification. And that when things reach a maximum, the wheel will stop turning, as it were, and once again, a heavenly order will be established on earth. That's all he's really trying to say. And so you don't really have to accept the book of Revelation to understand what he's talking about. This is a very ancient concept, a very ancient idea. And I'm convinced that this concept of the heavenly Jerusalem in the book of Revelation probably also has some kind of an ancient Greek antecedent. So let's just leave it there. And to conclude, the geometrical symbolism is actually a lot simpler than the way maybe Genon spelled it out. So once again, just to, in a few words, this is symbolic of the solidification of the world. The sphere is symbolic of a minimum of solidification. It properly belongs to the subtle domain. It is a maximum of possibility. And the cube is a maximum. It's the other extreme. You have two extrema. It is the maximum of solidification and solidity and fixity and determination, resulting in the solidification of the world. However, once you go all the way around, so to speak, they are two extrema, but it's almost like a circle. It's cyclical. And when you reach the extremity of solidification, there must be a correction. There must be a reversal. The 12 suns will shine. The earth will the pole will be shifted. The sun will rise from the west, and the Kali Yuga will end, and a new cycle will be inaugurated. This is how I understand this chapter. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best, and I appreciate your watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share.